Welcome to the Ambitious Broker Podcast, where elite real estate professionals share their secrets to success, discuss topics impacting their industry, and gain professional development insights. Enjoy today's episode. Welcome to another episode of the Ambitious Broker. Today's topic of discussion is the MLS. Roger, you say the MLS is in crisis. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a number of ways that the MLS is in crisis right now. It's being minimized a lot because of dilution, and I'll explain that in a second. Also minimized by the impact of the portals, and I think mostly minimized by the abuse that our profession's kind of putting it through, and even the danger report, which we've talked about, in previous shows. But I'll show everybody the picture. There's a copy of the danger report that was published by the National Association of Realtors, and everyone seems to agree that we've got a problem, with the MLS. So, dilution. Let's talk about that first. Basically, as an industry, if we're not taking our MLS and putting it to the highest level of integrity in terms of the validity, accuracy, and completeness of data, then we're starting to dilute our MLS. We've reached a point to where in the past, a lot of people that was associated with the industry would rely on our MLS. People like appraisers, as an example, and would count on. They would consider the realtor's MLS as the sacred cow, where all the great information was, information that they could count on to do their appraisals on properties, and they don't feel that way anymore. And often, even our own industry is having to go to multiple sources to try to assure a client they can give them accurate data as to what's going on in their area. The other part of it is, of course, the portals, and by that, we're talking about the Zillows and the IDXs of the world, places that we send information to, and that's adding further dilution. And by that I mean you've got sites like that are getting information sometimes before our MLS gets the information, and they don't have the same type of data control that the MLSs will typically do. So there's a bunch of things that are happening right now that puts the MLS in serious crisis. And I would say it's mainly our own doing. Portals are places on the internet where consumers can go direct and they can access information. Some of the more well-knowns, I think, are Zillow, Redfin, Movado. A lot of the franchise companies will have their own portals, Realtor.com, Homes Inc., or Homes.com rather, Curbed, and things of that nature. And those are places where the public can go to directly and access information about properties that are for sale. So that becomes sort of a competitor where people can go directly on the internet rather than go to some of their realtors. And then there's a thing called IDX, and it's a even real estate people aren't necessarily familiar with this, but by that I mean IDX, it stands for Internet Data Exchange, and what it means basically is that a lot of real estate people will have their own personal websites, and on their websites they will have these tools where when the consumer comes to their site, they can search and they can look for properties and do the same thing that they could do on the portals. So you have portals, which is these private the Zillow of the world, and then the realtors have their own way of getting that information out to the public via their websites, and that's called IDX. In both cases, what's happened is we're pushing information about properties listed out to the public, and in doing so, we're giving people more places to go to find information about homes. Within the multiple listing services, there's a lot of rules and regulations around the MLS, and it has to do with accuracy, thoroughness, and various things of that nature. Ethics about what's said about the homes, that there's some level of integrity about things that are said. And all the portals are not held to any type of standard at all. So as an example, the things that you see on Zillow, it's just using one of the portals as an example, you can see properties that say they're for sale, but they're not. They've been sold. They may have been sold 2 years ago, or they may have never actually been for sale, but yet they'll show that they're for sale. Or they've been taken off the market. They still show for sale on Zillow, or the information just isn't accurate. I've seen homes on Zillow as an example that you saw pictures of the outside of the house, and then pictures on the inside of the house were from a totally different house. So there's a big distinction between data that comes from MLS systems and the ones that often end up on these portals. So I just wanted to kind of point that out to people. As far as how do they get their information? Well, that's one of the most interesting misconceptions, I think, in the industry. I hear agents often talk about, well, I don't know why our MLSs give that information up, but in reality, every single broker who takes a listing is the one who is authorizing the information to be passed on to the portals. So the realtors often don't know that they, in fact, are doing that. I hear that all the time. The MLSs are letting us down, and I'll remind them, no, your broker, the guy who runs your company, is the guy who's letting you down if you feel like you don't want your information out there. So technically what happens is that the agents put the listing into the multiple listing service, and then the MLS will have a contract with each of the portals, and that contract will allow them to then pass it on to whichever portal a person wants. Usually the brokers have the ability to go on to their MLS system and then determine how they want their listings managed. If they want the MLS to send it on to, say, a Zillow or Realtor.com, or if they don't. So they have the ability to toggle on and off within their MLSs, but most brokers really don't know they can do that. So they feel like a lot of real estate people feel like they're being forced to it. So if any of the viewers of Ambitious Broker, if you don't want your listings put out onto the internet, you've got to go talk to your broker about it. The MLSs take their instruction from the responsible broker in the offices, or at least the person who's responsible within the MLS. Every firm will have one designated person who's the responsible person. So that's how it gets there, Christopher. We send it. Real estate people send it, and then they often regret that they do.
It sounds like a problem of our own making. And I wanted to change the subject. I heard about this thing called the 8.0 Clear Cooperation. And what was that all about, in your words?
Well, that's an interesting little event. We've talked a little bit about it being in crisis now, the MLS being in crisis, and a lot of it from our own abuse. It's The rules for MLS and all of its participants has been that when you take a listing, that you should have it in roughly within 48 hours, a couple business days. So if you take a listing on January 1st, then by January 3rd, that should be in multiple, and everybody who's a participant in multiple should have an equal shot at showing their clients. And, as a general rule, participants of an MLS feel that every client's better served by putting it in the MLS and getting all the demand that's possible. And frankly, that's really has worked for 100 years in MLSs. However, because of a number of reasons, one, of course, is the proliferation of the portals, and also because of a shortage in inventory. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, it became a pretty reasonably often practiced for some agents to not put their listings into the multiple, into the MLS system. And there's a lot of reasons for not doing that. Unfortunately, the primary one was that because of low inventory, they wanted to keep it off and try to sell it themselves before it was made available to anyone else. And in doing so, what they would often do is take a listing, put it into one of the portals, say a Realtor.com or a Zillow or Truly or one of those, and then try to find buyers themselves, and it never gets in the multiple. So you've accomplished two things when you've done that. One is you've reduced the value of the multiple listing service for the realtor profession. And secondly, you've taken and increased the credibility of the portals. Both things are bad for our industry, yet that became a standard practice. So the MLSs were not doing a good job, frankly, of following up. And, I question whether they ever will again, to be honest with you. But so because of that business practice, it started to really spread throughout the United States. And as it did, and other realtors felt the abuse of not having those listings available to them, and seeing the way it was hurting clients, both sellers by not having more demand on their property, and buyers by not being able to equally compete for properties that they might want. So in either case, it was a problem. And then eventually they complained and they complained and they complained. And it's a very big, slow bureaucracy, the National Association of Realtors, but it finally percolated its way up to there, and they changed the rules a little bit, and officially passed, I believe, November of 2019, and that new rule was called 8.0 Clear Cooperation Policy. So I know that was a long answer to your question, but what Clear Cooperation Policy said was that if you're going to put the house on the market, you're going to advertise it in any way, whether it be a sign, whether it be a newspaper advertising, a flyer in the window of your office, whether you put it on one of the internet portals, whatever it is that you do to market it, that within 24 hours, it must be in the multiple. So the old rule was get it in within a couple of days. The new rule says it must be in within a day if you're going to go and market the property. So there was a big push, of course, for that. And then it passed. It surprised me, frankly, that it passed, but it did. And then what they did is they allowed, the National Association of Realtors allowed each of the local MLSs to make up their own policies around that, around the Clear Cooperation Policy. And that meant that the statuses could be custom, the fines, any kind of penalties related to violating 8.0 would be left to the local MLSs and associations. And I should make a distinction, by the way, that in most cases, the MLS and the associations aren't necessarily the same. So what we're really talking about is the MLS system. So that's the way it's come down. And 8.0 is designed to hopefully clear that up. I think we've got a slide that you'll be able to show on the screen. But the mandate was that by May 1st, 2020, that every MLS have their new policy and rules and penalties in place and functioning. So here we are now in November, and it's up and running, and it's become interesting, to say the least.
That is incredibly interesting. My next question is, who's behind the MLSs? Who operates them? Who runs them?
Well, it's a good question, and another thing that a lot of our ambitious brokers aren't really aware of. There's really two types of MLS systems. One is an MLS that's privately owned and that they run within some area, and there's a lot of them. And they sell that MLS service to real estate companies and or associations. And then there are others that the Association of Realtors actually owns themselves, and they then promote it. If you take, say, Los Angeles, where we're based, and you look at some of the MLSs here, you have an MLS like ChrisNet. And ChrisNet is actually owned by the Southland Association of Realtors. So they function and operate that MLS. A nearby MLS is one called CLAW, one called CRMLS. One of those, CRMLS, is owned by a private entity in partnership with 15 or 20 different associations. Typically, they're smaller associations, and they pool together and they partner. And then you have some that are totally private. So it ranges. The significant difference to be pointed out there is that if an association or even the MLS is obtaining an errors and omissions insurance policy, which they need, and they get that policy from the National Association of Realtors, the National Association of Realtors then has some power over how they operate. So if you're not going to follow some of their guidelines, like 8.0 clear cooperation, as example, then you're probably not going to be able to get their errors and omissions policy. And it's typically much cheaper than it would be to go to an outside entity. Now, if you're a private MLS, you don't have any obligation to follow the 8.0 clear cooperation at all. So I think that kind of sums up who runs them. They could be anything, private, partnership with associations, or association owned entirely.
Could you dig a little bit deeper into that? Is regional MLS different?
Well, that's a great question. Actually, a regional MLS is very different, and typically what you get with regional MLSs is you'll get what we refer to as data sharing. So you'll have a single multiple listing service, and you'll have maybe contiguous MLS areas, and then through some agreement to share their data, they then sort of become regional, meaning that as a member of one MLS, in the case of the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, that's ChrisNet. So if I belong to ChrisNet, we have information to our MLS. Then that data also gets shared with other multiple listing services. Their members have access to ChrisNet data then, and then ChrisNet members have access to the data of other people's. And it's had a very significant impact on the real estate business. As an example, take the San Fernando Valley again. If you were to go back 10 years or 15 years, 20 years ago, you would find that 95 or better % of all the business done in the San Fernando Valley was being done by brokers in the San Fernando Valley. Now, if you take the same geographical area, because of data sharing across all these MLSs, different MLSs, we find now that about 35% of the sales being made in the San Fernando Valley are now being made by brokers whose offices aren't in the San Fernando Valley. And that's very problematic. At least in my mind, it's become kind of problematic.
How did this become so problematic?
Well, it's problematic because there's some real conflict within the industry about how far a realtor should actually go with a client and to do business. Regional MLSs have, and data sharing has enabled a real estate agent, say in one area, they can travel 100, 200 miles now with a client to do business. And while a person is licensed to do so, say within the state of California, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should. It's almost like saying, an attorney went to law school, got his law license, but you find out that a lot of them specialize because they need to go deeper in a single category so they can provide better service. Legally, they could probably practice any kind of law, but they'll generally specialize. You'll find that's true with doctors. Often that's true with, insurance people and other specialists. But in real estate, for some reason, they've decided that sharing this data across these broad geographical boundaries seems to be okay. I believe that I've got a lot of evidence that shows it's been very detrimental to the industry and detrimental to clients as well. In fact, I'll give you one example. There was a market crash in 2007, 8, 9, you might remember. And during that market crash, they made some changes in the lending business. And what they decided to do was come up with these appraisal companies so that when a mortgage lender wanted to do a loan for a buyer, they would call an appraiser. And in the past, these lenders always had a relationship with appraisers. In fact, the appraisers would build their business around building relationships with mortgage people and getting called to do the business, and that's how it worked. When the crisis and crash came, they changed it to appraisal companies. And now a mortgage person would have to call the company, and the company would assign an appraiser. Often they were assigning appraisers that were 50, 60, 100 miles or more from the house that they were actually appraising. So for probably a year and a half, you had people complaining, real estate people complaining that these appraisers were traveling all this way and they had no idea anything about the properties. They didn't know the nuances of the local area. And as a result of that, they were not appraising the properties properly. So you can see where that makes a lot of sense. But what's interesting is that an appraiser will do an appraisal a day, maybe at least once a week. So that means that over the course of a year, they're doing 50, 60, 80, 100 appraisals a year. So their skill to appraise properties, is pretty well practiced. On the other hand, real estate agents today, 70% do less than 3 transactions a year. So for some reason, the real estate industry went crazy about highly experienced appraisers doing something, but at the same time, they think it's okay that real estate people who only do a transaction or 2 a year should be able to go 100 miles or so. It's been very damaging to consumers, and people in the industry are torn between the two. But that's what the data sharing and the regional MLSs has enabled people to do. So, and it is controversial. People have different opinions about it. It's also done other things. As example, the data share, particularly with the new 8.0 clear cooperation issues. what it's done is it's taken each of these MLSs who have their own independent set of rules, and now it has these people overlapping. So you have people from 50 miles away who belong to one MLS coming up into a different area, and in that area they have different rules. So you can imagine, take the San Fernando Valley, when 35% of the business in the area is being done by people who are outside the area. That means that 35% of the people are operating under a totally different set of rules within an area where other people are who are locally based have to operate. So you can envision the kind of conflict that might take place over rules and showings and ethics and things of that matter, all the way down to some serious conflict in procuring cause.
What is procuring cause?
Well, that's a good question. Procuring cause, often two brokers will be competing, and maybe not even knowingly competing, but often a buyer will see a piece of property with an agent, and then the buyer will go off and end up writing an offer with a different agent altogether. So the one agent who works really hard to find that house ends up working and spending time, money, gas money, and their resource to find a buyer property, and then that buyer goes and uses another broker. So within the professional standards of realtors, there is this feeling that we don't want to be perceived by the public as a bunch of unprofessional people stepping on each other and putting everybody down. So as a result of that, they have decided that a person who feels like they found the house for the certain buyer can go and file a claim that they were the procuring cause. They were the reason that buyer bought that house. And if so, the association then has the ability to divide up the commission in whatever way they feel is appropriate. But here again, if you're from one area and you come into my area, and we have different perceptions of what procuring cause is, or we have different belief systems. As an example of that is some areas have rules of procuring cause where whoever wins the procuring cause gets all of the commission or none. And then in other MLS areas or association areas, they can be split, where they can make a decision to give one agent 50%, the other agent 50%, or any makeup they want. So you can imagine with all these different rules, as people now, clash with each other with all these different rules, it really can be confusing, and it could also, because of the confusion, could also start to impact the profession's, view of the profession, professional standards, ethics, and the associations and the MLSs, and all this is contributing to this crisis that the MLSs are going through now.
Do you have any closing thoughts, Roger, for today's episode?
Well, I think so. Yes, I think that my closing thought for all the people listening to the show would be that you get very serious about this. The multiple listing service is probably the greatest marketing tool that's ever been given to our profession. And when it's handled right and everyone just lives up to their agreement, if we join an MLS, then the MLS has rules and we should follow those rules. And that gives everybody equal playing field. So if you're an ambitious broker, I think it's important that you understand that if you join the MLS, follow the rules and then expect everyone else to follow the rules, and push back to management of the MLSs and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do, and they're imposing the proper penalties, and they're imposing the proper enforcement of all the rules. It's up to you as an individual agent to make sure that the data is accurate, it's complete, that when you get an opportunity to sit in front of a client and go through comps You want to get there and assure those clients that you're giving them accurate data, up-to-date data, and that takes a cooperative effort from everyone that's a participant. So I think my closing thoughts is, I don't know how you felt about your MLS before, but I hope that you'll escalate your perceived value of the MLS and really treat it well, and it'll treat you very well. So I think that's it, Christopher. I think we've touched it all.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of the Ambitious Broker Podcast, where elite real estate professionals share their secrets to success, discuss topics impacting their industry, and gain professional development insights. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please rate it and leave a review.